For over a decade, I watched my boss take credit for everything I built, from groundbreaking algorithms to entire system architectures. People called him a genius, but he couldn't even read half the code. When I quit, he laughed in my face. 6 months later, I stood on stage in front of 3,000 experts and ended his career in less than 10 minutes. My name is Lena Caldwell, and for over 11 years, I worked at a company called Nexora Tech, a mid-sized but rapidly growing tech firm that specialized in enterprise-level optimization algorithms. From the outside, it was the kind of place people dreamed of working at: open-floor offices, stocked snack bars, and sleek press releases talking about the breakthroughs we were supposedly making. But on the inside, at least in my corner of the building, it was a different story. I was hired fresh out of grad school, armed with a passion for systems engineering, and a brain that couldn't stop untangling puzzles. I lived for building solutions, refining performance, and optimizing structure. And in those early years, I poured every ounce of myself into that work. I had no idea that someone else would be quietly taking credit for it all. Martin Greaves was my manager from day one. He wasn't the worst boss I'd ever had, at least not at first. In fact, I thought he was kind of brilliant in those early months. He spoke confidently, handled pressure well, and was excellent at pitching our team's results to executives. He wasn't hands-on technically, but I assumed that was because he'd moved into leadership. What I didn't realize until much later was that Martin didn't just step away from the technical work. He never understood it to begin with. He had mastered something else entirely, making other people's work look like his own. And for a long time, I was the perfect target. I didn't like office politics. I didn't network. I was quiet, kept my head down, and let my work speak for itself. But as I learned the hard way, in corporate tech, your work doesn't speak, it whispers, unless someone with power chooses to echo it louder. The first time I saw my name omitted from a quarterly report, I brushed it off. Maybe it was an oversight. Maybe the project list had been trimmed for space. It didn't matter, I told myself. The important thing was that the solution I'd developed was being implemented, and the company was benefiting. Then it happened again, and again. Whole product roadmaps were being drafted with my contributions erased. Martin would sit in executive meetings and present the ideas I had sketched on my whiteboard just a few days before, sometimes using the exact phrases I'd written on the corner of a napkin in our one-on-ones. I started keeping backups, logs, dated notes, not because I expected revenge or even recognition, but because a part of me knew I was disappearing from the narrative, and I wasn't okay with that. I tried confronting him once. It was late. Most of the office had gone home, and we were reviewing performance results from an optimization model I'd spent 6 months refining. I pointed to the dashboard and said, "I think it would be fair if the architecture for this went under my name in the update." He didn't even look up from his screen, just muttered, "We're a team, Lena. It's not about individual credit." I remember feeling my chest tighten. I wanted to say, "Then why are you the only one ever mentioned?" But I didn't. I nodded like I understood. That moment stayed with me for a long time, not just because of what he said, but because of the way he said it. Like I was being unreasonable for wanting to be visible, like I was being difficult for wanting the truth to matter. It wasn't just Martin, though. The deeper problem was how easily the rest of the company played along. The VP of engineering would nod enthusiastically during Martin's presentations, complimenting him on his innovative vision. HR sent him congratulatory messages when our team hit big milestones, as if he had written a single line of code. I remember being in a leadership offsite once, listening to Martin walk through a technical solution I had personally architected over a weekend of no sleep and too much coffee. The CEO turned to him and said, "You've really outdone yourself." Martin smiled, said thank you, and never once looked in my direction. I wanted to disappear. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell the truth. But I knew how it would sound. Like bitterness. Like pettiness. Like someone whining for praise. And I was too damn tired to argue anymore. So instead, I planned. Quietly, carefully, and over many months, I began gathering every bit of documentation I could. Code commits with my credentials, emails with date-stamped algorithm drafts, architecture diagrams with my annotations, even Slack logs where I walked junior devs through design logic. I backed up everything not on company servers, but on encrypted drives, just in case. I wasn't doing anything illegal. In fact, I had written the company's own data ownership policy years ago, a policy that explicitly stated engineers retained rights to their personal development artifacts and research notes, as long as they weren't bound by NDAs. Martin had signed off on it without reading a word, back when he still needed my help drafting internal policies. I had made sure of that. I submitted my resignation 2 weeks later. My hands didn't shake, I wasn't angry anymore. I was calm, focused, maybe even relieved. Martin called me into his office, pretending to be surprised. "Seriously?" he asked. "Why would you walk away now? You're just hitting your stride." I didn't answer. I just slid the resignation letter across his desk. He glanced at it and smirked. "You'll be back," he said, leaning back in his chair. "There's not a lot out there for people like you, Lena. You're technical, sure, but not a leader. You're a great assistant. And you're pushing 40. People don't hire support players at that age." I remember sitting still, letting him say it all. I think he wanted me to argue or cry or beg him to see my value. But I didn't do any of that. I just said, "You'll see," and walked out. What Martin didn't know was that while he was busy polishing his imaginary crown, I had been having quiet conversations with people who actually understood what I could do. 6 months earlier, I had been approached by a startup competitor called Cybernova. Their CTO, Dr. Marco Lin, had seen some of my open source contributions and reached out to talk. He didn't know I was at Nexoratech at first. Not really. But once he realized it, he started asking careful questions about my role there. I told him I couldn't share proprietary info, but I was interested in new opportunities. That conversation led to others. Eventually, he offered me the role of Chief Technology Officer at Cybernova. I took it. No one at Nexoratech saw it coming. They assumed I'd end up as a mid-level engineer somewhere, maybe at a smaller firm or consulting. Martin especially thought I'd vanish quietly, a footnote in his long list of self-written success stories. But I had spent over a decade building systems that worked, solving problems others couldn't even see, and documenting everything in the process. And now, finally, I was going to build something of my own somewhere I was actually seen, somewhere I had a seat at the table. Somewhere I wasn't just the brain behind the curtain. What hurt the most, I think, wasn't the lack of recognition. It was the constant, quiet dismissal, the way people acted like my silence meant I didn't care, like I didn't notice. Like it was okay to erase me because I hadn't made noise. But silence isn't weakness. Sometimes silence is strategy. And while Martin had been busy selling a lie, I'd been carefully gathering the truth. And the truth had teeth. What came next would change everything for both of us. What Martin didn't know, what no one at Nexoratech knew, was that I had been preparing for this moment for nearly 2 years. It started the night I heard him bragging at our annual winter party, standing near the open bar with a glass of scotch in his hand, and an audience of interns, half listening, half adoring. "The core architecture, that was all me," he said loud enough for the room to hear. "People think these things get built by teams, but sometimes it just takes one person with vision." I stood across the room, pretending to refill my drink, pretending I didn't hear every word. But something shifted in me that night. I realized I wasn't just being overlooked anymore, I was being erased, and I was done playing along. That night, I went home and opened the private vault on my external server, a place where I had been saving everything since the early days. Source code files with timestamps, engineering logs, version control commit histories, architecture designs, annotated revisions, and more. 11 years of contributions, cataloged and archived with obsessive precision. Every major project we delivered had my fingerprints on it, and I made sure to capture all the proof. I didn't need to steal company data. I had always worked smart, kept personal iterations, cleaned versions, and backups of my designs. Because long before Martin started lying about the work, I had a quiet instinct that if I didn't protect what I'd built, someone else would claim it. And of course someone did. But the real twist, the piece I was proudest of, was that I had written the internal data rights policy myself. About 5 years into my time at Nexoratech, I was asked to draft a policy that governed intellectual property created by engineers outside of formal contracts. I crafted it with intention, making sure to include a clause that allowed employees to retain personal archives of their research and development as long as those archives didn't include confidential client data or final production code. Martin, true to form, skimmed the document and signed it without a second glance. It was his signature, ironically, that gave me the legal foundation to keep everything. I wasn't breaking rules. I was following the exact ones I had written and he had approved. When I turned in my resignation, I kept things quiet at first. I didn't storm out or burn bridges. I didn't announce it to the team or make some grand gesture. I let HR process it, shook a few hands, and cleared out my things with a steady calm. But on my last day, just after lunch, I walked into Martin's office one final time. He barely looked up. "So, where are you headed?" he asked, with that same smugness he always used when talking to people he thought were beneath him. I smiled, placed an envelope on his desk, and said, "I've accepted the CTO position at Cybernova." That got his attention. He looked up like I'd slapped him. "You're joking," he said. "That's our biggest competitor." I nodded. Exactly. I can't explain how satisfying that moment was. Watching the realization hit him, watching the cracks form in the armor he'd spent years polishing. He tried to recover, of course tried to pretend it didn't matter. "They'll chew you up," he said. "You don't know how to lead." I didn't argue. I just said, "I guess we'll find out," and walked away. What I didn't say, but what I knew in every fiber of my being, was that I was walking into that role with more experience, more knowledge, and more proof than he ever had. Cybernova didn't just hire me for my resume. They hired me because I brought innovation. I brought clarity. I brought the future. It only took a few weeks for the shift to begin. The first product update I helped launch at Cybernova contained an entirely new algorithm, one that left Nexoratech's current systems in the dust. It was more efficient, faster, and capable of adapting to real-time environmental variables that Martin's team hadn't even begun to consider. We didn't make a big announcement. We just let the results speak for themselves. Clients noticed. The tech community noticed. Suddenly, people started asking questions. How is Cybernova doing this? What changed over there? And right behind those questions came the ones that made Martin sweat. Wasn't this similar to the framework Nexoratech claimed they developed? Didn't Martin Greaves create something like this years ago? Martin tried to act like nothing was wrong, but the truth was written all over his face. He started posting more on LinkedIn, trying to assert thought leadership, writing vague posts about innovation cycles and vision-driven architecture. But when people replied asking for technical insights, he couldn't answer. Because he didn't know. He never did. And with every new release we launched at Cybernova, his grasp on credibility slipped further. The algorithms we were deploying weren't just new. They were evolved versions of the systems I had once built in silence. But now, finally, I was the one signing off. I was the one leading the team. I was the one standing in the spotlight. There was one more layer to my counterattack that hadn't yet surfaced: the patents. Over the years, Nexoratech had filed 18 different algorithm patents, all under Martin's name. Not one of them listed me as an inventor. It used to bother me the way my ideas were legally tied to someone else's legacy. But now I had documentation, timelines, drafts, emails, and digital trails that proved I had authored those concepts before they were ever submitted. I didn't go to court. Not yet. I didn't need to. I quietly reached out to the right people in the tech legal community, shared what I had, and let it circulate. Soon enough, whispers began, and once those whispers reached Nexoratech's board, the pressure would start mounting. Meanwhile, Cybernova gave me room to breathe. For the first time in my career, I wasn't the hidden architect. I was the leader, the strategist, the decision maker. And the team they built around me? Brilliant, hungry, focused. We worked like a machine, efficient, balanced, collaborative. And every time we launched a new feature, every time the press mentioned my name, every time a conference invited me to speak, I thought about all the years I spent invisible. I thought about every time Martin said I was just support, that I was too technical to lead. And I smiled, because I knew he was watching it all fall apart, one innovation at a time. It didn't take long for cracks to show back at Nexoratech. Without me maintaining the systems, performance began to falter. They tried patching things, reassigning engineers, spinning new stories, but nothing worked. The optimization models began degrading. Client complaints rose. One former teammate messaged me privately. We can't figure out how you made the load prediction model adapt so quickly. No one understands the variables. I didn't answer, but I took a screenshot. I saved it. Just another receipt. Meanwhile, Martin agreed to speak at a global tech symposium that fall. He was scheduled to present on algorithm innovation in enterprise systems, my exact area. I marked the date on my calendar. When the day came, I didn't attend in person. I didn't need to. I watched the live stream from my office at Cybernova, headphones in, tea in hand. Martin took the stage, tried to deliver a speech filled with buzzwords and vague claims, but the Q&A crushed him. Experts from across the world, people who knew what real innovation looked like, started asking detailed questions about the architecture, the data pipelines, the adaptive layers, and he stumbled, fumbled, deflected. He looked lost. And then, the moment I'd been waiting for, Dr. Andrea Velez, a well-known AI researcher, stood up and said, "I've reviewed your system. It bears uncanny resemblance to the work of Lena Caldwell now at Cybernova. Can you explain that?" The room went quiet. He tried to recover, but the damage was done. He stammered something about team collaboration, about shared development, about legacy contributions. But everyone in that room knew the truth. And I knew, watching from afar, that my silence had spoken louder than his career ever would. That was the moment Martin Greaves began to fall. And the best part? I didn't have to do anything but tell the truth and let the truth do the work. One of the reasons I could move so freely was because Nexoratech had never considered me senior management. Despite me running the architecture of nearly every system that kept the company operational, I was classified as a technical contributor. That meant I didn't sign any non-compete clause. I wasn't bound by senior-level executive agreements, and there was nothing stopping me from joining a rival company, and that, of course, was exactly what I did. In under 6 months, my team at Cybernova launched a suite of next-generation optimization algorithms that didn't just compete with Nexoratech systems, they made them irrelevant. Their legacy infrastructure couldn't adapt, couldn't evolve, couldn't keep up. It was both thrilling and unsettling to watch it happen in real time. We started releasing white papers, open-source snippets, and demo videos that quickly went viral within the tech community. I gave talks about the principles behind the systems, leaning into transparency, teaching the way I had always wanted to teach when I was invisible. And the more I explained the logic, the structure, and the vision, the more people began asking, if Lena built all of this at Cybernova in just months, what was she building all those years at Nexoratech? That question lit a fire under the entire industry. People dug into old case studies, technical publications, and system benchmarks. They began to realize that the innovations Martin claimed had never matched his skill set. And that's when the spotlight started burning. Martin tried to hold the stage at conference after conference, but without me behind the curtain writing his scripts, designing his visualizations, and prepping him for Q&A, he collapsed under pressure. His slides were vague, his charts outdated. And the questions were brutal. Researchers and CTOs from all over the world asked for details about the adaptive runtime, the recursive feedback loops, the decision tree modifiers. And each time, Martin answered with phrases like, "Our team handles that," or "We're currently exploring some approaches," or "The specifics are confidential." But they weren't confidential. He just didn't know them. Because he never did. I had kept him standing for over a decade, and now finally, he was wobbling alone. People began to suspect the truth, but suspicion wasn't enough for me. I wanted clarity. I wanted correction. So I opened a formal challenge with the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office to review the authorship of 17 patents currently registered in Martin's name. I had all the evidence version history from our development environments, emails with time-stamped attachments, project logs, and even internal Slack messages where I'd brainstormed features in real time. I hired a top-tier legal team with expertise in IP litigation and began the long process of reclaiming what was mine. The tech world doesn't usually pay attention to these battles, but once it hit the news that someone was challenging Martin Greaves's legacy, the noise got louder. And it wasn't just noise. Journalists started reaching out. I turned most of them down, but I did agree to one interview with a respected industry magazine. I told my story plainly. I didn't dramatize it. I didn't smear Martin's name. I just walked through the timeline of what I had done, when I had done it, and what I had documented. The article went viral. It sparked conversations about how often women in tech are sidelined, how often attribution is stolen, how companies lean on quiet talent without ever promoting or crediting them. People began to share their own stories, and suddenly it wasn't just about me. It was about all of us. Meanwhile, Cybernova was thriving. The system we launched was adopted by 2 major enterprise platforms and had already been implemented in 4 government contracts. We were doubling our user base every month. I built a team that operated on mutual respect, where ideas mattered more than titles, and questions were welcomed instead of punished. For the first time, I didn't feel like I had to fight to be heard. I just spoke, and people listened. And I remembered how many times Martin had told me I was too quiet, too passive, too academic, too focused on the tech, and not enough on the business. But now I was leading both. And he was nowhere. Eventually, the pressure became unbearable on Martin's side. His keynote at the European Systems Symposium was an unmitigated disaster. The system demo crashed. The architecture diagram he showed was plagiarized from an open-source project, and when he was asked about the latest benchmarks coming out of Cybernova, he actually said, "We don't consider them a real threat." The audience laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. He wasn't just losing credibility, he was becoming irrelevant. And I didn't even need to say a word. His silence, his incompetence, was doing all the work for me. What made it worse for him was that the industry was no longer just talking behind his back. They were talking publicly. Blog posts, tweets, open letters, tech forums were dissecting his past presentations, pointing out inconsistencies, quoting phrases he'd used that didn't even make sense to people with technical backgrounds. Someone uploaded an old keynote where he said, "We use a variable recursive learning model with dynamic echo filters," and then linked to research papers proving no such system had ever been part of Nexoratech's architecture. The comments were brutal, and once the ridicule starts, it's hard to recover in tech. The patent battle came to a head when my legal team submitted a side-by-side comparison of the original design documents I had created and the final patent text Martin had filed. They were nearly identical. Even the diagrams were the same. My signature had been scrubbed from the margins, but the metadata in the scanned originals told the truth. When the board at Nexoratech caught wind of what was happening, they launched an internal review. A week later, Martin was suspended. 2 weeks after that, he resigned. Quietly, no press release, no goodbye message to the staff. Just gone. The patents were refiled under joint ownership, with me listed as the original inventor. It wasn't full justice, but it was real. And I'll take real over perfect every time. In the months that followed, I found myself speaking at the very conferences where I used to sit in the back taking notes for someone else. Only now, I was the keynote. I was the expert. I was the one being quoted. And when people asked me how I got here, I told them the truth. I didn't arrive with fireworks. I didn't rise on a pedestal someone built for me. I earned every inch by working in silence, by documenting my work, by refusing to let someone else define my worth. And when the time came to fight, I didn't lash out. I showed the receipts. And I let the truth do what truth always does, cut through the noise. One day, I received a letter in the mail, not an email, not a call, a handwritten envelope with my name in sharp cursive. It was from Martin. I didn't open it right away. I left it on my desk for 3 days, unsure if I wanted to hear anything he had to say. But on the 4th day I opened it. It wasn't long, just a page and a half. He said he knew I had every right to destroy his reputation, and that he was surprised I hadn't done more. He admitted he had taken credit for things he didn't understand. He said he had been scared that if the world ever knew how little he actually knew, everything would collapse. And in the end, it had. He closed the letter with one sentence I'll never forget.
"You didn't just build systems, Lena. You built a legacy, and I'm sorry I ever stood in the way."
I didn't write back. There was nothing left to say. The past was over. The damage was done. But I took no pleasure in his fall. I didn't need revenge for revenge's sake. All I ever wanted was to be seen clearly. to have my name beside my work, to stand on my own merit. And now I did. Completely, unapologetically, finally. It was almost surreal watching Martin unravel in public. A man who once commanded every room with a smug kind of authority had started posting vague, hollow updates on social media, like a high schooler trying to seem relevant. Things like pushing the boundaries of innovation again or exciting times ahead in algorithmic evolution. But there were no specifics. No papers, no code, no benchmarks, no evidence. Just empty phrases that the community didn't buy for a second. I scrolled past each post the way you glance at a car crash, shocked but not surprised. It didn't take long before the comments started asking hard questions, real ones. Things like, can you explain the adaptive filtering process in your last system update? Or, why haven't we seen any new innovation under your leadership since Lena left? He never answered. The pressure was building toward a breaking point, and we all knew it would happen on the biggest stage of all, the Global AI and Systems Conference in Toronto. It was one of the largest gatherings in our field, drawing over 3,000 experts from around the world. I'd been attending it for years, always from the audience, always silent. But this year, everything had changed. Martin had been invited to deliver a technical keynote, and the entire community was watching closely. He needed to prove he still had substance, that he was more than a talking head. But of course, we all knew the truth by then. He had nothing, and no one to hide behind. The conference hall was packed. The anticipation felt like static in the air. I was sitting near the front with my team from Cybernova, including our CEO, Dr. Marco Lin, who had become a true champion for my work. The lights dimmed, the logo spun on the screen, and then Martin walked on stage with that same fake confidence he always wore when he didn't know what he was talking about. He started the presentation with a recap of his supposed contributions, most of which had my fingerprints all over them. He spoke in sweeping generalities, never citing actual data or specifics, just throwing around buzzwords like scalability, resilience, and predictive layering. But it was the Q&A that broke him. The moderator opened the floor, and right away, Dr. Irene Zhao, a brilliant systems engineer from Stanford, stood up. Her voice was calm but direct. "Mr. Greaves," she said, "can you explain the reason your last update to Nexora's optimization kernel removed support for asynchronous processing in favor of serial task blocks? It seems counterintuitive given current best practices." Martin blinked, paused, then fumbled with an answer that didn't even address the question. Something about keeping things modular for future development. The room shifted. You could feel it. 100 minds silently concluded, he doesn't know. Next was Dr. Rachel Gomez from the University of Madrid. She didn't even try to soften the blow. "You often talk about recursive architecture, but your public systems haven't demonstrated any real recursion beyond a two-level loop. Are you misusing the term?" Martin laughed nervously and claimed it was proprietary. But again, he gave no substance, just noise. A third hand went up, then a fourth. The questions got sharper, more technical, more precise. He had no answers, only evasion, only deflection. And that's when Marco stood up. Dr. Marco Lin didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse or insult. He simply said, "With respect to the panel and the community here today, I feel obligated to clarify something for the sake of intellectual integrity. The core algorithms that Mr. Greaves has claimed credit for over the past decade were, in fact, authored by Lena Caldwell, our current CTO at Cybernova." The room went silent, not gasping, not chaotic, just quiet. The kind of quiet that means everyone's processing a truth they already suspected. Marco looked straight at Martin. "And she's here today." All eyes turned toward me. I hadn't planned to speak. I hadn't prepared anything. But I stood. I walked to the stage, every step heavy with history. When I reached the podium, I looked out at the crowd. Doctors, engineers, professors, inventors, students. people who had followed my work without knowing it was mine. And I began. The truth is, I never wanted credit, I said. I just wanted the work to be real, and it is. I clicked to a slide showing the original system flow diagrams from my early drafts. What you're about to see isn't confidential or proprietary. It's knowledge, and it should be shared. I walked them through the evolution of the core algorithms, from the early linear optimization layers to the recursive adaptive engine, from hand-coded debuggers to machine-tuned modifiers. I showed version logs, development timelines, benchmark data. I explained every decision, every dead end, every breakthrough, and with every slide, I felt lighter. I wasn't just reclaiming credit. I was finally speaking as myself. Not as someone's assistant, not as the ghost behind a curtain, but as the architect, the builder, the author. When I finished, there was a pause, and then applause, rising like a wave, a full standing ovation, 3,000 experts on their feet, for me. Martin stood to the side, arms crossed, face blank.
But I didn't look at him. I looked at the audience, at the future, at everything that lay ahead now that the truth was finally in the open.
The moderator walked back up and said simply,
Thank you, Lena. That was the most technically transparent keynote we've ever hosted.
He didn't mention Martin. No one did, because by then Martin was a shadow. He hadn't just lost credibility, he had lost relevance. The moderator invited him to return to the panel, but a voice from the crowd said,
He shouldn't be up there anymore.
It wasn't angry, just honest. Martin didn't argue, he left the stage, and for the first time in years it felt like the air had cleared. Later that evening, at the post-conference dinner, I was surrounded by strangers who now felt like allies. People who thanked me, who asked real questions, who wanted to learn. Irene Zhao raised her glass and said,
To Lena Caldwell, for showing us what quiet power really looks like.
And I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not just pride, but peace. The lie had fallen, and the truth stood taller than ever. 6 months later, I walked back into the same auditorium where everything had changed. But this time I wasn't in the front row as a quiet attendee, or standing in the wings waiting to be introduced by someone else. I was the keynote speaker. My name was printed across the main banner in bold letters. Lena Caldwell, Chief Technology Officer, Cybernova, Keynote, The Future of Adaptive Intelligence. There were cameras set up along the back wall, broadcasting live to universities and research centers around the world. The seats were packed again, this time with more energy, more curiosity, and I felt it in my bones, the difference between being recognized and being seen. I stepped up to the podium with a calm kind of confidence I had never allowed myself to feel before. I wasn't there to prove anything anymore. I was there to share, to teach, to lead. I unveiled a new system my team and I had been developing, a learning model that could evolve in real time based on environmental input. Something that changed the way we understood feedback loops and algorithmic processing. The response was overwhelming. People weren't just interested, they were excited. They weren't nodding politely, they were leaning forward, asking questions, scribbling notes. And when the talk ended, the standing ovation returned. But it felt different this time. It wasn't about vindication. It was about respect. Cybernova became the industry leader. That wasn't just marketing spin, it was backed by numbers. Our contracts multiplied, including the one Nexora Tech had held for over a decade with the Federal Systems Consortium. When that renewal season came, they chose us instead, not because we underbid, but because our work outpaced theirs by light years. Their infrastructure couldn't match our adaptability, our efficiency, or our vision. Nexora Tech's stock price started falling a week after the announcement, and their board released a quiet statement a month later. Martin Greaves had voluntarily stepped down from his role as CTO, but I knew better. Everyone did. It wasn't voluntary. He had no choice. Behind the scenes, I had been working with an intellectual property attorney to revisit the patent filings for the 17 algorithms Martin had claimed credit for. With my original code versions, dated documentation, and personal log files, the case was airtight. Patent authorities reopened the filings, and within 3 months, the authorship was officially corrected. My name was listed as the sole inventor on every system. I didn't make a public announcement. I didn't need to. The truth had already found its voice. But when I saw the updated filings in the registry database, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel through the chaos closure. One quiet afternoon, a package arrived at my apartment. There was no return address, just my name written neatly in blue ink. Inside, I found a short handwritten letter. The penmanship was clean but tense, like someone had rewritten it more than once. It was from Martin. He didn't offer an apology. Not really. He didn't say he was sorry for what he did. Instead, he said this: "I always knew you were better than me. I was afraid of being irrelevant, afraid of being overshadowed. I told myself you were just detail-oriented, just good with code. But deep down, I knew you saw the whole picture. I lied to everyone, but the worst lie was the one I told myself, that I deserved it more than you." I sat with that letter for a long time, not because I was moved, but because I wasn't. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel satisfied. I felt done. I didn't write back. There was nothing left to say. He wasn't part of my story anymore. And maybe that's the real victory, not watching someone fall, but realizing you don't need to be tethered to them to rise. He had tried to bury me in the background, but I didn't stay buried. I grew. I built. I created something that couldn't be stolen because it was rooted in who I truly was. And now, the world finally saw that version of me. The one I had fought to protect all these years. The one who didn't just write code, but reshaped an entire industry's approach to innovation. A few weeks after the letter, I was invited to speak at an international summit in Berlin. On the flight over, I looked out at the clouds and thought about the girl I used to be. The one who worked nights and weekends, who corrected Martin's mistakes without credit, who stayed silent to keep the peace. I thought about how far she'd come, and I felt this deep, quiet gratitude, not for the struggle, not for the betrayal, but for the strength it forced me to find. I used to think success meant getting recognition. Now I know better. Success is knowing that I am exactly who I was meant to be, and that I built it all myself. At the summit, someone asked me during a panel, "What advice would you give to someone who feels like they're being overlooked at work?" And I said this as clearly as I could: document everything, know your worth, and never let someone else's fear of your brilliance dim your light. You don't have to be loud to be powerful, but when the time comes, don't be afraid to speak. The room went still. Then someone clapped, then another, and suddenly I wasn't alone anymore. I saw myself in their faces, and I knew that if my story helped even one person rise out of someone else's shadow, then it was worth every moment of silence I had endured. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's walking into a room and knowing you belong. It's building something so brilliant that even your enemies can't deny it. It's realizing you no longer care what they think because you're too busy doing what you were born to do. And that's exactly where I am now. Standing tall, unapologetically brilliant, and finally free.